Here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a breaking news town hall from Zeteo. Another breaking news town hall because the news doesn't stop breaking these days, especially in the Middle East, where we've just seen the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the head of head of Hamas's political bureau, former prime minister, Hamas prime minister in Gaza, killed on Iranian soil in Tehran, according to New York Times on Thursday morning by a remotely controlled explosion in his guest house while he was visiting Iran for a presidential inauguration. If you didn't think things were heated enough in the Middle East, well, we've now got the assassination of a Hamas leader on Iranian soil, presumably by Israel. I have a very, very interesting guest joining us today to take some of your questions and mine. Gershon Baskin joins me from Jerusalem. He's formerly an analyst, a negotiator with the International Communities Organization. He's been a negotiator with Hamas on and off for 17 years. Gershon, welcome to Zeteo. Thank you for joining us today from Jerusalem. I don't think there's any Israeli who has had direct or indirect contacts consistently with Hamas for 17 years other than you, has there?
I don't think so, not to my knowledge. And what's amazing is that I've only been threatened to be arrested twice during the 17 years that this has been going on. And for a very brief period, and I basically told the security people who came to warn me that they should shove it.
Well, we'll talk about the relationship between Israel and you in a moment. Let's just get your initial reactions to this big news. Wednesday, 2 a.m. Iranian time, early hours of the morning. Haniyeh is killed in this explosion. At first, we thought it was a missile strike. Now the Times is reporting it was an explosive smuggled into the building several months in advance. Huge security breach in Iran for this to happen. We know the Mossad in Israel has gone around the world killing people for a long time. The attack came just hours after an attack that killed a Hezbollah leader in Beirut. What was your initial reaction? How, were you surprised, shocked, worried?
The only thing surprising was the timing of it. It's very clear that the government of Israel is going to go after all the leaders of Hamas, both inside Gaza and outside in Doha, in Istanbul, wherever they may be. The timing was, I think, more directed to send a message from the Israeli government to Iran rather than a message to Hamas, because Haniyeh, even though he was the head of the Politburo, he's not the key figure right now in terms of what's happening in Gaza. It's Yahya Sinwar that the Israelis are really after. Killing Haniyeh is a tactical achievement for Israel, if we can use those words. It doesn't change anything strategically in the Israeli-Hamas relationship. Haniyeh will be replaced quickly, within days, if he hasn't already been replaced. He was an important figure, but not the most important figure. And it's all part of this ongoing tragedy between Israel and Palestine that some people believe there's only a military solution to, and there's never been a military solution to this conflict. But yet it goes on and on.
What's fascinating to me, Gershon, is over the last 25 years, it's not just we've had the multiple Gaza conflicts, we've had multiple assassinations carried out by Israel against its enemies. We also had the quote unquote war on terror, where the United States also went after its enemies through drone strikes and killings. There was a famous Onion parody headline, which was #2 in Al-Qaeda killed again. Because we just kept killing the leaders of this organization. And as you say, not only is there no military solution, I wonder, do we learn nothing? Do our intelligence chiefs in the US, in the West, in Israel learn nothing from the idea that you can't kill an ideology just by taking out its leaders? That's one point. And separately, and you and I have discussed this, and you've talked about this in the past, this idea that killing someone like Haniyeh, does it not just lead to escalation, retaliation? Are Israelis right now worried that Hamas is saying we're going to carry out a revenge attack? Iran saying we're going to retaliate. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, said we must retaliate. Surely this just makes Israelis less secure.
I think it makes us less secure. I think it guarantees us escalation at a time when there were negotiations for a ceasefire. It has frozen those negotiations. The negotiations were actually frozen before the Haniyeh assassination. I think it's Israel's in a position where, after the failure of October 7th, Israel lost its total deterrence. And part of what it's been doing over the last 10 months is trying to rebuild the deterrence, meaning we want our neighbors to be afraid of us. That's basically the message of Israel, that we can get to you anywhere you are at any time we want. And we choose when to go after you and where to go after you. And this is the message from the Israeli side. Don't mess with us, because we can get to you. And I don't think that anyone in Israel at the level of national security and the intelligence and the army really believes that the assassination of Haniyeh really changes anything.
It's ironic you say that we can get to anywhere because the guy Yahya Sinwar, who they say is the mastermind of October 7th, he's fine apparently in Gaza, yet they had to kill 14,000 kids and still couldn't kill Sinwar. So yeah, you can kill a precision attack. I find it ironic, Gershon, that the Israeli intelligence service and military can precisely kill people in Beirut and Tehran, but cannot precisely kill a Hamas commander in Gaza. They have to kill 40,000 people, including tragically 14,000 children. Let me ask you this. I wrote a piece for Zeteo yesterday reacting to the assassination. And I said, look, why do they do it? The question is, why do this? Why kill a guy who's not just, they see him as somebody involved in the October 7th attacks. We should point out Karim Khan, the ICC chief prosecutor, requested an arrest warrant for Haniyeh, as well as Sinwar and one other Hamas commander. But the reality is, as every obituary in the Western press has rightly pointed out, by Hamas standards, he was a pragmatist. By Hamas standards, he was the guy running the negotiations with your government, with the Israeli government, for hostage negotiations in Qatar, in Doha, where he was based. So why kill him now? And I said very bluntly, the Israelis have form on this. The Israelis have killed Hamas leaders before who are in the middle of negotiations, who are in the middle of ceasefire talks, who are in the middle of offering a truce to Israel, and Israel kills them because Israel doesn't want to have a deal with Hamas.
No, Israel doesn't want to deal with Hamas, for sure. Netanyahu doesn't want to deal with Hamas. Netanyahu doesn't want a ceasefire and doesn't want the war to end. He does want the Israeli hostages home, but he's not willing to make a deal that will bring them home. He has a self-political interest of keeping this war going. His victory picture that he's waiting for is the killing of Sinwar. I believe that if they were to get to Sinwar, that might be the excuse that Netanyahu uses to show the public that he's had his total victory. It's likening to Hitler in the bunker kind of picture. This is the end of the war. We have defeated them totally. As I said, killing Haniyeh, it doesn't achieve anything in terms of Israel's war goals, but we have to understand that a huge percentage of what Israel has done in Gaza has nothing to do with any kind of political strategy or diplomatic strategy. It's about revenge. It's about October 7th, and Israelis are traumatized and still are living the trauma of October 7th. And much of what they have done in Gaza, the destruction, 2 million people homeless, tens of thousands of people have been killed, including a lot of non-combatants, innocent women and children and elderly people. And there are tens of thousands of new orphans in Gaza. All of these people are potential recruits for Hamas. If Israel remains in Gaza, the longer Israel remains in Gaza, the more we can be assured there will be armed insurgency against Israel. They can't defeat the Israeli army, but they can kill a lot of soldiers. We saw that in the 18 years that Israel occupied South Lebanon.
So let's talk, and I want to bring in some of our subscribers who are asking questions. Please do put your questions in the chat. We'll try and bring in a few for Gershon to answer. Before we get to our subscribers, a couple more questions from me. I mentioned the history of Israel killing Hamas leaders who were involved in ceasefire negotiations. One very famous incident was 2012, prior to the 2012 Israel-Gaza war. In fact, it precipitated the 2012 Israel-Gaza war, was Ahmed Jabari, who was a Hamas military commander who you were talking to via other Hamas people, and you had a draft ceasefire proposal, I believe, that you had showed to Ehud Barak at the time, who was a senior member of the Israeli government. Netanyahu was prime minister back then, because Netanyahu feels like he's always been prime minister of Israel at this point. And you were very close to getting this Hamas commander to sign off on a ceasefire proposal. What happened, Gershon? Tell our subscribers what happened.
Ghazi Hamad, who was the person that I negotiated in the Gilad Shalit release in 2011, that released the Israeli soldier, was in captivity 5 years and 4 months, and 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. After we had succeeded in bridging that gap and bringing about an agreement, we started talking about a hutna, a long-term ceasefire. And we began drafting. We were exchanging it back and forth. I think the fifth or the sixth draft of the agreement, Ghazi Hamad called me in the morning and told me that he just met Ahmed Jabari, who was the military commander of Ezzeddin al-Qassam, the military wing of Hamas, and he had given Ahmed Jabari a draft in Arabic of our latest version of it, and we were quite optimistic. We were making progress. It wasn't quite at the finish line, but later that day, Israel assassinated him. Now, I'm quite sure that they didn't assassinate him because they knew that he had received this draft of the paper that we were working on. They assassinated him because they could. They had the intelligence information. And because every person who had anything to do with the abduction of Gilad Shalit, the killing of 2 soldiers on that day that he was abducted, and the holding of him for 5 years, was killed by Israel. Every single one of them. Not a person who touched Gilad Shalit is alive today. And this is part of the Israeli history. It goes back to the Munich Olympics, where everyone who was a part of that was eventually assassinated. Almost everyone was eventually assassinated by Israel. Black September, and as you said, a whole long history of assassinating people.
But assassinating people also, as I say, in the middle of negotiations is madness. That it really is revenge. I want to go to our audience questions, but before I do, have you had contacts with Hamas since October the 7th?
I have. I've been in contact regularly, not so much over the last month and a half. During the month of May, I was actually in contact officially. In other words, I was formalized by the Israeli side. That lasted for a period of 2 weeks, probably until they informed Netanyahu that I was running the secret direct back channel. I was immediately called to Tel Aviv and shut down. It went on for about 2 weeks when I was exchanging messages and trying to offer some new ideas on how to reach an agreement, but that ended in the 3rd week of May.
And on that, I'm going to ask a question that it's not asked enough in the Western media, but I have to ask it. We keep being told in the United States, where I'm based, that Joe Biden and others say, well, Netanyahu has agreed to the hostage deal, which he hasn't. I think that's a straight up lie from the Biden administration. Hamas is the bloc. Hamas is the bloc. And the UN even passed a resolution in the Security Council saying Israel signed up to this, according to the Americans. Hamas has not. If you were looking at this objectively, taking out all emotion, who's a terrorist group, who's a democratic government, blah, blah, blah. Who is the bigger bloc to a deal right now, Thursday, August the 1st? Is it Hamas, this group designated as terrorists by the entire Western world, or is it the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu, in your view, Gershon?
It's both sides, actually, because the deal that Hamas is wanting is very, very difficult for Israel to accept. It's a defeat. It's a surrender to Hamas demands. But Israel has put conditions on the table, knowing that Hamas will not accept them. Israel has said that it wants to keep the Gaza-Sinai border, what's called the Philadelphia corridor. It wants to keep the Netzarim corridor, which divides Gaza in half. And Israel wants to verify the identification of every Palestinian moving from the north of Gaza, from the south of Gaza back to the north of Gaza. Israel doesn't agree to end the war, only agrees to a temporary ceasefire.
Yeah.
Israel wants
that's the most bizarre thing I find. Let's have a ceasefire, but we get to carry on the war. Isn't that the very opposite of a ceasefire? I mean, words have no meaning, apparently, for Benjamin Netanyahu. Gershon, let's bring in some of our audience members. Well, just a comment from Andrea Ruland says, it's funny how Israel is suddenly able to make targeted attacks. There must be some super shield around Gaza that makes such attacks impossible. A great sarcastic point there from Andrea, the point I made earlier. Let's bring in Dina Solomon, who says, is it just about revenge? You mentioned revenge. Or is it about achieving a longer-term strategy and an opportunity to seize the land and expel the authentic inhabitants, the Palestinians of Gaza?
There's no doubt that there are people in the Netanyahu cabinet who want to resettle Gaza and want to evict the Palestinians, the 2.2 million Palestinians living there. Netanyahu said in Congress, he said repeatedly in Israel, that Israel has no intention of resettling in Gaza. So I don't think it is really about conquering Gaza and staying there. It is conquering Gaza and keeping the military there. To prevent the threat of October 7th ever happening again. For 20 some odd years, Israelis have been living on the border and fired with rockets, and it's just can't go on where you have this militia next door shooting rockets at civilian communities in Israel. But we have to understand that the root cause of all of this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the continued occupation of Palestine by Israel and the rejection by Israeli governments of a two-state solution. This is what it goes back to. Palestinians will not surrender their rights to have equal rights with the Israelis on self-determination.
You just reminded me, Gershon, very important question we got to get from you as an Israeli who's dealt with Hamas. This idea, especially since October 7th, that Hamas has been rebranded as Hamas is ISIS. And you remember after 9/11, Sharon said, well, the PLO is Al-Qaeda. Like Israel always wants to identify its opponents with the worst people in the world to get the West on board. Hamas is obviously not ISIS, right? It's a ridiculous comparison. But this idea that Hamas are so extreme, they just want to kill all the Jews in Israel. They're not rational actors. They have no interest in any kind of agreement. Anyone who says anything otherwise is an apologist for Hamas. This is what you get. That's what I get when I talk about you as someone who's dealt with them. Can you just deal with this two-state solution issue? Is it not the case that the Hamas charter, the updated version or whatever we want to call it, and Hamas leaders like Haniyeh have talked about a two-state solution of some form on the West Bank, Gaza, 1967 border. I find it ironic that I've heard more Hamas leaders sound open to that than members of Netanyahu's cabinet. Am I wrong?
Well, sort of, because Hamas has said that they'd be in their revised charter, and people like Musa Abu Marzouk and Haniyeh and a few others have said they'd accept a Palestinian state on the occupied borders of 1967, meaning West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Without recognizing Israel, without making peace with Israel. They also demand a full right of return for Palestinian refugees to their original homes, which means inside of Israel. So it's a far cry from an acceptable two-state solution to Israelis who would be willing to accept a two-state solution. But it is a certain move away from their original charter, which was a state of Palestine from the river.
And it's more than Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir are saying. That's my point. My point is Hamas have talked more about a two-state solution than members of this Israeli government.
Sure, definitely. No, the Israeli government instead said against a two-state solution.
Let's bring in, we had a question here from Vanessa Botiga. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name, I butcher everyone's names. I agree that this is a war about revenge and Israelis are traumatized. It's confusing to me that this war is being supported, though, by most Israelis. Can you address this? Do you see a way forward?
Yeah, it's a very bizarre situation in Israel because the public is very divided, for instance, on the issue of the hostages, where about 50% of the public are willing to make almost any deal with Hamas to get the hostages home. On the other hand, a majority of those, including a majority of all Israelis, want the war to continue. They bought into this notion that we must defeat Hamas entirely and remove it as a threat from our lives forever, without recognizing that there is no military defeat of an ideology. You beat ideologies with better ideologies. You beat ideas with better ideas. And the idea that can defeat Hamas is the idea that Palestine will be real to Palestinians, that they will have peace and dignity, that they will have freedom from Israeli occupation. This is the ideology that has to defeat Hamas. And if it was there by an Israeli government saying, we are willing to make peace with the Palestinians and allow them to have the same right that we have to self-determination on this land between the river and the sea, with Jerusalem as a shared capital, or however you want to deal with it, there are ways of dealing with this peace. Making Palestine real for Palestinians is a way to defeat Hamas, which is why I say it's so important that the United States finally recognize the state of Palestine, which may not end the occupation, but it begins that process of making Palestine real to Palestinians. It removes the veto on Palestinian statehood from Israel, which must be done. If you talk about a two-state solution for 30 years, you have to recognize both states.
Well, let's hope the Kamala Harris campaign are watching people like you saying this point, because that would be a big move if they had the guts to do it. We've got great questions from our subscribers. Thank you all for joining us on a Thursday morning if you're in the United States, Thursday afternoon if you're in the Middle East. Kaleem Hussein, please carry on sticking questions in the chat. We'll try and take more of them. Kaleem Hussein says, we had many analysts state that a choreographed response by Iran took place in Israel after the attack by Israel on the Iranian consulate in Syria back in April. That was the last big first open exchange of fire between these two countries. With the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, he says, what kind of response do you, Gershon, envisage will take place from Iran, Hamas, and the wider quote-unquote resistance groups, he says?
I think there will be a coordinated response between Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. I don't know what it is. I would think that they will probably try to do something bigger than they did on April 14th. There are really two surprising things that have happened from this war so far. One is the reemergence of the two-state solution, which I, as an advocate of the two-state solution for the last 40 years, am quite amazed that it's back on the table when I thought it was dead. And the other big surprise was on April 14th when Iran attacked Israel, that a regional defense alliance was born without negotiations, without agreements, and Israel's neighbors defended Israel. And this is quite amazing. And in it is the answer for how to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well in the region with our neighbors of resolving this conflict. Now, I think that Iran and Hezbollah will try to hit some strategic infrastructure in Israel. I hope that they won't be casualties of innocent human beings, because that will lead to escalation. There needs to be a calculated response and hopefully a de-escalation that will enable us to renew negotiations on a ceasefire in Gaza, because the war between Israel and Hezbollah will end at the moment that the war in Gaza ends.
So that's a great point. That's a point I've been making for a long time. You want to deal with Lebanon, you want to deal with all these other issues. You've got to deal with the what's going on in Gaza right now. You mentioned the Arab countries coming to Israel's defense when Iran fired those drones. Got to ask the question. a lot of Muslims I speak to will always say, well, you know what? The Muslim countries hate Hamas as much as Israel. That's the problem. That's the problem for Palestinians, is that they'll make lots of song and dance about supporting the Palestinian cause, but in private, and I wonder if your discussions with Hamas confirms that Hamas knows this, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, even the Egyptians are telling Israel in private, yeah, finish Hamas off. We'd love for you to finish Hamas off. Is that what your understanding is?
No, I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot from Israelis. I haven't heard it so much from Palestinians, but I have heard it around the region from other regional actors, from Saudi Arabia, from the Emirates, from Bahrain. No one likes Hamas, and they would really be happy if Israel were to deal Hamas a deep blow and remove them from the map here. On the other hand, a lot of these Arab countries have helped to facilitate dialogue and agreements between Fatah and Hamas, the latest one taking place in China between 14 Palestinian factions. I think it was agreement number 7 that these parties have signed, which is almost the same agreement they once signed it in Mecca, swearing on the Quran that they were going to implement it and never did. So I think even amongst the Palestinians, there are a lot of Palestinians who would be happy to see Hamas go. On the other hand, almost no Palestinian is happy with the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas, and they want him to go. And they see no legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, who they see as collaborators with Israel in keeping the occupation for all these years.
Edward Walsh asks, has Hamas been more willing to unite with other factions, including those in the West Bank, to present a united Palestinian leadership? You mentioned Mecca. There's been kind of quote unquote reconciliation agreements and unity governments in the past, which again, Israel has helped undermine. Israel hasn't really been interested and doesn't like the idea of a united Palestinian front. Is there some scenario now going forward where Mahmoud Abbas and co join up with Hamas?
I hear from Palestinian colleagues who are in deep dialogue with Hamas people who have been to Doha several times and met with the leadership there. The primary problem is not the integration of Hamas into the PLO or into a technocratic government that would govern instead of the Palestinian Authority, whether it be the West Bank or Gaza or just Gaza. The main problem is that Hamas until now refuses to lay down its weapons. Hamas wants to be Hezbollah. They want to not have the responsibility of governance, but they want to keep a military force, a militia in their own control in Gaza. And this is the main stumbling block to Palestinian unification. At the end of the day, Hamas soldiers need to be integrated into a Palestinian security force, which is part of a peace agreement with Israel and the region. That's the recipe that we need to learn the bad lessons from Iraq, when the Americans had the entire army of Saddam Hussein fired and become unemployed and enemies of any kind of future Iraq scenario. So we don't need to see that happen in Gaza.
Gershon, just to push back a bit, just to put some counter stuff to you before I go back to our audience, you were criticized heavily by a lot of Palestinians, a lot of people in June, when you wrote an open letter in the Times of Israel, an open letter to Palestinians. You can break this cycle. And you talk about there being not enough good leaders. You talk about what you just mentioned, the kind of militarization, the militia point. What would you say to your critics who say, at the end of the day, you may not like Hamas, you may not like armed attacks, you may not like the way Palestinians run their society under occupation, but the reality is that the occupation is at the core of this conflict and this struggle and this violence, and therefore the burden is on the occupier, not the occupied, to end.
I agree 100%, and I said that in that article as well. The problem is the occupation, and you would expect the strong side to make the first steps. But that's what Palestinians have been waiting for decades. And what I said in the article, it's not only a matter of being right, because they're right. It's a matter of being smart. And what I suggested is that Palestinians need to understand that Israelis are not their enemy. Israelis are their allies, because it's only through Israeli agreement that they will achieve statehood, independence, freedom, and dignity. They need to address Israeli fears. And that's why I suggested if the Palestinians can overcome the rightness of the argument that Israel should take the first step and understand that if they address Israeli fears, they will find support amongst Israelis for their rights.
So I'm gonna push back again, Gershon, in 2 ways. Number one, when you say they're allies and address the fears, a lot of people say we don't apply that standard in any other conflict. No one says to the Ukrainians, you should address Russian fears and Russia's actually your ally if you can persuade them to come on board, number one. And
no, I didn't say Israel is your ally. I said the Israeli people, Israelis.
Well, people wouldn't say the Russian people are the allies of the Ukrainians. I'm just saying we don't apply the same logic. I get where you're coming from. But number two, in terms of the substance, we had this quote-unquote peace process in the 1990s. The Israeli public moved to the right since because people like Ehud Barak and Benny Morris, I would argue, said there's no partner for peace on the other side, and the Israeli society moved to the right over the last 20 years for various reasons. But even at the height of the peace process, where you did have Israelis saying we support two-state solution and Palestinians supporting a two-state solution, even then, though, the occupation went on, settlements went up, killings of Palestinians continued. So even when Palestinians are not doing quote-unquote suicide bombing campaigns as they were in the 1990s or the Second Intifada or whatever it is, there's a lot of Palestinians who would say it's just fanciful to say if we lay down our arms, if we all turn into Gandhi, Israelis are fine with us. That's just not the case.
Well, I didn't say they should turn into Gandhi and lay down their arms. I think they should, but that's not what I wrote. What I
that
said
wouldn't
is,
stop, for example, settlement expansion, would it, Gershon?
No, it wouldn't. But let's not forget that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by someone who was opposed to the peace process, and Rabin was moving forward, and Rabin froze settlement building. It was Netanyahu who took over afterwards and started destroying Oslo. We were on a different path during the time of Yitzhak Rabin. And I believe that we know that from recent research that's been done in Israeli society by a very reliable organization called Accord that shows that if the Israeli public believed that the Palestinians were sincere about living in peace, a majority of Israelis would support ending settlements and withdrawing to the Green Line, making agreements with the Palestinians for Palestinian statehood. It is Israeli fear, which is justified. Look, I have for decades heard Israelis and Palestinians, when I talk to them, and I talk to Palestinians and Israelis every day, tell me we want peace, but they don't. And the only response to that I have is, you're right, because what you hear and what you see is proof every single day that Israelis and Palestinians don't really want peace. And we need to change that. I think that the Palestinians are right in their resistance against the occupation. But now they need to be smart and think about what's the fastest road to get to liberation. The fastest road is not what they've been doing for the past 56 years. It hasn't worked. So I say, look at different things that could change the perception of Palestinians amongst Israelis.
Well, rather than talking abstract, let's talk in specifics. Robert Haling asks, how should the Israeli state deal with the 700,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem? We all remember what happened when the military took out the settlers from Gaza. All the protests and resistance had to be dragged out. But that was just a fraction of settlers today, true? And Robert says, I would say today they're much more radical and armed, right?
They are, they certainly are, and they're much more dangerous. But if we were on the path to peace and a two-state solution based on the 67 borders, roughly a 4.5% annexation of land in the West Bank in exchange for land inside of Israel on a one-to-one basis would incorporate about 80% of the settlers within sovereign Israel. We'd have to deal with 20% of the settlers who would have to be informed that they can remain in the state of Palestine as Palestinian citizens or residents under Palestinian sovereignty and law if they want to, or come back home to the state of Israel. But on date X, the Israeli army is withdrawing and will no longer be there to protect them. The Palestinians need to agree that their state should not be Judenrein, should not be void of Jews, that Jews would be welcome to live in a Palestinian state under Palestinian sovereignty with Palestinian law, not as armed militia in apartheid separate communities, but integrated into the state of Palestine.
I'm just going to push back slightly then and say, of course, I agree with you. Jews should be able to live in a Palestinian state. Palestinians should be able to live in an Israeli state. The issue is the settlers. Those are not just random Jewish tourists wandering around the West Bank. They are there in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and need to leave. Anya asks, Gershon, in a conversation, she's asking me actually, in a conversation you moderated in Doha several months ago, Mehdi, Daniel Levy called out the two-state solution as a carrot on a stick, I'm paraphrasing, a way of the West and Israel to pretend they're pursuing a solution that they know is not a solution in order to prolong the genocide sidestep criticism. Is, in this case, why center the discussion around a two-state solution? Is there a viable alternative to this? And actually, we've had a few other questions along these lines. I won't read them all out, but people asking about, well, why focus on this dead two-state solution? What about one state with equal rights for everyone?
Look, the one-state solution is a nice idea, but October 7th pushed it further away from reality than ever before. The Palestinians need to have sovereignty over their own lives. They need to have a state of their own where they're decision makers of their own fate in a society which is run by them. I think that the future has to bring about some kind of confederation situation, something like a mini-European Union. But the road to confederation is the end of the occupation and the liberation of Palestinians in their own sovereign state. One state is an ideal utopian idea, but Israelis and Palestinians have been killing each other for 100 years over a territorial expression of identity. It's not that we want to live in the United States of Israel-Palestine, which is not a Jewish state or a Palestinian state. People are fighting to have a state with their identity on it. And we all claim that we give our identity to the land and we take our identity from this land, and we're talking about the same land. So I thought the two-state solution was dead also, but all of a sudden it's back on the table, and I think we have to deal with it seriously and urgently because it won't be here for long.
You say one-state solution is a utopian idea, and maybe it is, but it's interesting that when we talk about two-state solutions, the reality is that even after a two-state solution, Palestinians, Israel still won't be happy because they have an objection to Zionism and being treated as second-class citizens.
We have to make sure that the state of Israel becomes the state of all of its citizens also.
And that needs to happen, but it doesn't seem to be happening, and that's a longer discussion for another day.
I'm, by the way, a member of a political party that was founded called All of Its Citizens, which is dedicated to working on making Israel the state of all of its citizens.
Which Benjamin Netanyahu very explicitly says it's not, and so does the Jewish nation-state law. That's a longer discussion for another day. This discussion is coming to an end. I want to squeeze in a couple more audience questions before we finish. Tom Hall says, why hasn't Israel taken responsibility for this killing in Iran?
This kind of Israeli policy, you could ask the same question about Israel's alleged nuclear arms. There's something about being ambiguous in these situations. Israel's policy was always never to take responsibility. We have a lot of loudmouth, foolish, stupid ministers and politicians who have taken responsibility for things that in the past would have never had Israel taking responsibility for. So I think that this is Netanyahu demonstrating a bit more control over the loudmouth, stupid politicians in his cabinet. But it's obviously that Israel did this.
James Stout, sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. Do you think that Netanyahu really wants to draw the US into another regional war, but this time against Iran?
Maybe, probably. There's loud voices in Israel within the cabinet, probably amongst Netanyahu himself, who believe that the real enemy is Iran and we have to attack Iran. A war between Israel and Iran is insane. And it could only be done with the United States being in the war as well. And I think that the current United States administration and any future US administration based on recent history would be extremely foolish to have boots on the ground again in this region. And I don't see that happening. Even if Netanyahu wants it to happen, I don't think it would happen.
Well, a similar question, Hadi Assad asks, having listened to Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, saying that they, Hezbollah, will bide their time until a suitable, strong response, do you think there will be an all-out war, I assume, with Lebanon and beyond?
I hope not, but this is something which is unpredictable because it depends on what happens with their retaliation attack against Israel and what are the repercussions of that attack in terms of the damage and civilian casualties. So it could turn into a much bigger war than it is today. Hopefully it won't.
Hopefully it won't. We've had a lot of questions. I'm going to leave on that note. I like the word hope because we don't have much hope these days. Hopefully it won't. We're going to end the conversation on that note. Thank you, Gershon Baskin, for joining us from Jerusalem to give us your insights, having dealt with Hamas all these years, having been dealing with the Netanyahu government, as you said recently. Thank you all to Zeteo subscribers who joined in. Actually, there's a great question that's just coming through before we finish. We'll take one more question, if you don't mind, Gershon. Rebecca Aviz, who asked a question which I've been asking for a while. What do you think of Marwan Barghouti, who has been described as a Palestinian potential Nelson Mandela? He's in prison. He was a West Bank Fatah leader, not a Hamas leader. Is he someone who could unite the Palestinians? Is he someone who could get Hamas and Fatah together to try and do some kind of peace deal?
I know Marwan quite well. I worked with him quite a bit before he was arrested 22 and a half years ago. I've been communicating with him in prison over the last years, and there's no doubt that in terms of popularity, he is the most popular and most legitimate Palestinian potential leader in the future. Part of that is because for 22 years, he's basically been silent. People haven't heard him. But I think that Marwan could be a leader who believes in the two-state solution still. He believes in peace with Israel. I know from experience he's a very tough negotiator. He's a man who has integrity and he is not corrupt. And he is someone who believes in Palestinian unity, but he believes first and foremost in Palestinian liberation and ending the occupation. He believes that it can and should be done diplomatically. He is not willing to remove the armed struggle from his diplomatic toolbox, so to speak. He says that Palestinians have a right to resist even with the armed struggle, but his preference is definitely through negotiations and diplomacy.
Well, another hopeful note. Let's leave the conversation there. Sadaf Aga says, thank you. This was a very informative session. It was, Sadaf. I agree. Thank you all for joining me. Gershon, thank you for providing an Israeli perspective that we don't often hear. So appreciate you taking time out from Jerusalem. Stay safe. To all of you watching at home, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining this town hall. Please do subscribe as a paid subscriber to Zeteo. Get your friends, family to sign up, support this new media organization. We will see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.